Okay, be honest. Have you ever noticed how some people just like throw basically into like every other sentence?
Oh, yeah.
It's almost like it's punctuation, you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. It
Yeah.
can definitely feel like that.
Well, we are going on a deep dive today into this. We've got a blog post from Nala Madras.
Okay.
It's called The Power of Basically in Indian English. And believe me, it's about way more than just a word choice. We are going to explore how this simple word gives us a glimpse into Indian culture
Cool.
and Indian communication styles. And one of the things that's so interesting is how this blog post uses this example of an Uncle Raj character who's explaining Bollywood.
Right.
And just imagine like trying to explain Bollywood without ever saying basically.
Yeah, it's pretty difficult.
Right.
It's like, I think it really highlights how ingrained it is in certain communication styles.
Oh, totally. I can practically hear Uncle Raj now. But isn't there a danger of oversimplifying things with basically?
I mean, there's always a risk with that, but the blog post points out that basically is what linguists would call a discourse marker.
Hmm.
And you know how we might use like "ooper" or to kind of soften what we're saying or
Hmm.
like buy ourselves some time to think. Basically, does something similar,
Yeah.
but in a way that's very specific to the way people talk in India.
Right.
It signals a simplification or a summary, but it's also about navigating that kind of indirectness that's often valued in Indian communication.
So it's not just about making things easier. It's also about being considerate to the listener, not being too blunt, not being too direct.
Yeah, exactly. And this becomes really important in situations where directness could be perceived as confrontational. And the blog post talks about how often this happens in Indian American corporate settings. So you can imagine, like, you're trying to disagree with your boss.
Oh, yeah.
Basically, it can be a really useful tool in that situation.
For sure. I can see that.
Yeah,
Like,
sure.
you know, basically, we should reconsider this approach. It sounds a lot less harsh than this approach is wrong.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's almost like a subtle way of saying, I respect your authority, but I also have a different perspective.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
And this actually connects to a broader concept that linguists talk about called code switching.
Oh, yeah, code switching. Tell me more about that.
So it's basically, well, the basic idea is that we adjust our language depending on who we're talking to and the situation that we're in.
Right, so we all do that all the time, right?
Absolutely.
Without even realizing it.
We might use different language when we're talking to our friends than we do when we're talking to our grandparents.
Right.
But, in diverse cultures like Indian American communities, code switching becomes even more pronounced.
Yeah, okay.
And so basically, in a way, becomes this bridge between that more indirect Indian communication style and this more straightforward style that's often associated with American culture.
So it's like a chameleon. It's adapting to its surroundings.
Yeah, exactly.
But the author of this blog makes a really interesting point. They argue that this prevalence of basically, it's not just about communication, it reveals something deeper about Indian culture.
Yeah.
They're saying that it kind of hints at this cultural preference for consensus building and avoiding conflict.
That's right. And I think that's such an insightful observation.
Yeah.
Because they're saying that, the frequent use of basically might not just reflect those values,
Mm-hmm.
but also reinforce them.
Yeah, okay.
So it becomes part of a larger system of politeness and respect for hierarchy.
Right. So by using basically so much to kind of soften our statements and find common ground, we're subtly kind of reaffirming those values.
Exactly. And that's what I find so fascinating about these deep dives. We're not just looking at a word, we're really kind of peering into a cultural lens.
Right.
And it makes you wonder what other seemingly insignificant language choices
Yeah.
actually reveal a lot about a culture's values.
Yeah, for sure. It's like basically is this tiny little word with so much cultural baggage.
Oh, yeah.
It's really kind of amazing how much we can learn about a culture by just looking at how people use language.
Absolutely. And Indian English has some really fascinating examples of this.
Okay, like what? Give me an example.
Okay, so take the word propone. Have you ever heard that word before?
Propone. I think so.
So it's like the opposite of postpone.
Oh, yeah.
It means to schedule something earlier.
Propone is such a good word.
Right.
I feel like I've definitely adopted that into my vocabulary. It just
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it highlights this cultural emphasis on efficiency and getting things done.
Right.
But there are also more subtle examples. So think about how Indian English speakers often use only at the end of sentences.
Really?
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to the store only. Wait, do I do that?
You probably do, and you might not even realize it.
That's so funny.
It's like a small difference, but it adds this like extra layer of certainty or finality.
Right.
It's like saying, I'm definitely doing this and that's that.
It's like a verbal exclamation point.
Yeah, exactly.
But sometimes I wonder if these quirks of Indian English, can they lead to misunderstandings? Like, especially when you're communicating with people from other cultures.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid concern.
Yeah.
I mean, language is all about context.
Right.
And so what's perfectly clear in one context might be confusing or even misinterpreted in a different context.
Totally.
But I think that's also part of what makes studying language so fascinating. It's not just about grammar and vocabulary. It's also about understanding those cultural nuances.
Right.
Those unspoken rules
Yeah.
that shape how we communicate.
So how can we get better at kind of navigating these differences?
Yeah.
Especially with something as subtle as the use of basically.
Well, I think it starts with awareness. The more we're exposed to different ways of speaking, the more attuned we become to those subtle variations
Right.
in meaning and usage.
Okay.
And I think it's also about being open to asking questions.
Okay.
If you hear someone using, basically, in a way that you don't quite understand, don't be afraid to just ask for clarification.
Right, totally. Yeah, it's like instead of assuming we know what someone means, we should approach like every conversation with a sense of curiosity.
Exactly.
And a willingness to learn.
Yeah.
But beyond just like understanding each other, do you think that these linguistic differences can actually like teach us something about ourselves?
Oh, absolutely. I think the author of this blog post really emphasizes that.
Okay.
How language and identity are really closely intertwined. So by examining the quirks of Indian English, we're not just learning about a different culture.
Right.
We're also reflecting on our own linguistic habits.
Oh, okay.
And what they might reveal about our own background.
It's like holding a mirror up to our own way of speaking.
Exactly.
And asking like, what does this say about me?
Yeah, and like, for example, do you use basically a lot? And if so, why?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And you might find that, your use of basically or any word really reflects the values and communication styles of your own cultural background.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So maybe you use it to soften your statements. Maybe you use it to kind of create a sense of camaraderie. Or maybe you come from a culture that values directness and you rarely use basically at all.
Right. It's so fascinating how something as simple as one word can like, spark so much introspection.
Yeah.
It makes you realize that language is never just about like conveying information. It's about expressing who we are and where we come from. So as we're wrapping up this deep dive into the power of basically, what would you say is the key takeaway? I mean, is it just about being more aware of like our own language habits?
Well, I think awareness is definitely a big part of it.
Okay.
But I also think it goes a little bit deeper than that.
Yeah.
Because I think the real magic happens when we start to see language not just as this tool for communication, but as this lens for understanding ourselves and the world around us.
So the next time I hear someone saying, basically, I shouldn't do like, oh, that's interesting. I should think, what does this tell me about them? And what does my reaction to it tell me about myself?
Exactly. It's about cultivating a sense of curiosity, I think,
Okay.
and empathy when we interact with other people.
Right.
And it's also about recognizing that every language choice, no matter how small, carries all of this meaning
Yeah.
and cultural significance.
This has been such a great conversation. It's really amazing how much depth there is to something as simple as basically.
Right. It's a good reminder, I think, that there are hidden stories embedded in every language,
Yeah.
just waiting to be discovered.
And on that note, I think we'll leave our listeners with this thought. What are the words that you use all the time? And what do they say about you and your communication style and your background? Happy exploring.